Hello, and welcome to Together Apart. This is our second episode, a second series, second webinar gathering of this series. It's based on the podcast of the same name, which I'm the host of. And I'm joined today by Amanda Hess. She is the critic at large in the New York Times. She is somebody who I go to whenever I'm trying to figure out what is happening in the world and how to interpret it. Whether it is about women's social clubs or whether it is about celebrity culture or whether it is about me feeling really old on the internet. Amanda is my go-to voice, and that is true for many around the world. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. One of Amanda's most recent pieces, which I loved, was called In Praise of Quarantine Clapping. And I'm just gonna read a bit from it to ground us in an experience that's happening around the world and right now is happening every evening, I believe at 7:02 p.m. in New York. She says, "The highlight of my day every day is opening my window and yelling at the sky. Every night at 7 p.m., my Brooklyn neighborhood comes to life with the calculated whimsy of a cuckoo clock. It starts with a single neighbor clapping, soon dozens more join in, throwing open their front doors or hanging from their windows to put their hands together and say, woo!" And she goes on to say, "The clapping has surely been heard by doctors and nurses and EMTs, by UPS workers and Instacart delivery people, and the many other New Yorkers who are putting themselves at risk to protect their city. But the more the ritual is repeated, the more it feels as if it's for the rest of us too. We used to go out to concerts or movies or plays and clap for the performances. Now the clapping is the performance. It is our regularly scheduled programming, live and in person, when basically nothing else is." Welcome, Amanda. And thank you for joining us from Brooklyn. Tell us a little bit about this, this ritual that you are a part of now. And if you could describe it to us. I know there's probably a lot of callers that participate in it, but your kind of lens and eye on it. What is happening here?
Yeah, so it's something that I read about it before I heard it, and I read that it was inspired by similar kind of displays in other countries that had been affected by the virus before us. And when I first read about it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I'm embarrassed to say, like, I didn't consider going outside and actually doing it, but then I heard it, and it was so stimulating at a time when there's like no other stimulus, especially outside, other than ambulances. And then I heard it the next night, and we just kept hearing it, and we started clapping. I go on my stoop sometimes and clap. And the thing that's been really nice for me is that it's obviously the impetus is to thank people who are working on this and who are keeping all of us safe. But it's also just so important for everybody else. And I've learned so much about my neighbors who I never noticed before. Like there's this one, I'm fixated on a couple of them. There's one guy who lives across from me. I have no idea who he is, but he has this pot that makes like a really interesting sound. And so I love when he comes out. And then next door, there's this spaniel that comes out, and the spaniel like knows to bark throughout the experience. And so I look forward to that too. And yeah, it's the thing that I look forward to every day.
It's funny, as I was reading your piece, I was reminded of a tweet that I tweeted probably like 7 or 8 years ago. And I study gatherings. I am a facilitator. I wrote a book on gatherings, and I one of the things that I found again and again is the power of kind of collective, synchronistic, at the same time motions that we've really stamped out, particularly of the West and particularly in the US, is sort of this individualistic culture. And I tweeted something like, wouldn't it be amazing if every morning we as a nation just did one synchronistic act together? And I sent out the tweet, and I've never gotten more hate mail for a tweet, because people were like, that sounds like the Soviet Union. Like, that sounds like the country that is not the country I want to live in. Are you a communist? And I was surprised by the vitriol. And I think it's actually an interesting moment as we look to Italy, as we look to Spain, as we look to India, as we look to these moments of kind of national ritual that these spontaneous, I mean, I know the first one in New York was planned, as you wrote, by a strategic marketing firm, but the repetition is organic, and I think it's actually hitting a real need.
Right. I mean, one of the critics of the clapping who I quoted in the piece is a woman in the UK who she described it as it sounding like England had become North Korea. But the way that she described it was clapping at the sky, which to me, I was like, that is what we're doing. And that sounds like a beautiful thing to me, clapping at the sky. Like, what else am I doing that's better than clapping at the sky right now? But there is something I think that's interesting where, like, intellectually I know from news reports that this is happening around the city and my state and country and the world, but it really is such a local phenomenon as well. It doesn't feel like a show of national pride so much as like a community event, and that's something that's appealing about it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, in a moment, we're actually going to invite two others who are calling in from Italy and from India, and I'll introduce them in a second. If you are listening and you've dialed in about 10 minutes, we'll also be taking questions live from you all, from our listeners. And so if you have a question you'd like to ask, or an experience of a ritual that you, or a gathering that's new to this moment that you'd like to share, we're looking for examples, to just push the raise the hand feature in Zoom. And if you're chosen to ask a question or to share your story, you'll hear from one of our producers in the chat when you're on deck. So that will happen soon. But before I do that, I'll say one more thing about this ritual, and then we'll go to we'll welcome Dana and Priyanka. And I think that this the resistance and skepticism, and I think healthy skepticism of kind of collective synchronistic ritual, comes from not wanting to be forced to do something that doesn't have an organic need, right? That it's actually either submitting to a higher power, and whatever the relationship to that authority is. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this moment, if you take clapping as this very simple ritual that people are starting to be a part of, is that there's still expression, right? There's still space for individual expression, like you talk about, you know, whether it's the clambering pots or this, you know, the Cocker Spaniel. You write about how it sounds different on different streets in New York, and there are certain streets that don't clap at all. And one of the things that we look at when we're gathering, and particularly right now in the moment of Corona, is gatherings are powerful when they're actually sprout from a specific need and purpose. And in this case, everybody can understand this clapping is actually for the frontline workers. We are actually, it's an act of gratitude, right? It's not an empty, there's a purpose, and we've all bought into the purpose. And so I'm going to invite actually two folks who have joined us today from Rome, Italy, and from New Delhi. We have Dana Vittel and Priyanka Narayan coming in. If you both want to join our videos, join the chat. Welcome. And we'll go kind of around the globe. Dana joins us from Rome. And Dana, are you with us? Yes, welcome.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. So Dana, we have so many of us, I think at least for me, the first image that I saw of this, you know, the world was watching first China and Wuhan, obviously, and then we kind of went to Lombardy and Italy, and then, you know, each country at different moments has kind of had our focus, but Italy has played such a huge part of, I think, our collective psyche and our collective, you know, fear of the future, but then also watching the you know, these elements of beauty as well. Tell us about what it's been like for you in Rome, you know, why you're there, and what the I don't know if it's clapping, but what is the collective kind of outdoor balcony ritual is for where you are.
Absolutely. Well, first, Priya, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with all of you. My name is Dana. I am a New Yorker who recently relocated from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to Rome to work in international development. And I'm living in San Giovanni, which is a classic working Roman neighborhood on the border of one of Rome's most beautiful parks, Parco della Capparella. And we are, as you know, in our 7th week of quarantine. We were one of the first countries to implement a quarantine, and we've been under it for a significant amount of time. And I think, as everyone knows, Italy is one of the hardest hit countries, and being here on the ground since the beginning, it's been illuminating. But speaking, Priya, to what you were saying, the sense of community has been very inspiring. And I think if you have visited Italy before, or if you have watched a movie about Italy or seen Italy in popular culture, basically, you know it's synonymous, especially in Rome and the streets of Rome, with music on the streets. And that is a fantasy of Italy that is quite real. And as somebody who lives here, it's something that you absolutely love and treasure about living in Italy, and about your Italian neighbors and this wonderful community that you're a part of. So this collective singing from the balcony started very early on in the quarantine process. And I remember I was actually on a Zoom call with friends around Rome when we all first went out on our balconies to listen. So it was this very interesting blend of modern technology, which was connecting me in my neighborhood to friends in Monteverde, friends in Campo di Fiori, with hearing these beautiful music, which I wish, again, my Italian is embarrassingly bad, so bear with me, but singing songs like Abbracciami, which translates to hug me, or Ma il cielo è sempre più blu, which is the sky is always bluer. These patriotic, uplifting songs. And the first week of quarantine, we had clapping for first responders that were returning. It is so amazing to see this now a tradition that my parents, who still live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, have sent me video at 7 o'clock in New York of people cheering for the shift changes that are happening. So it's really, really amazing to see these messages of hope, the sense of community that's, for me, feels very organic, that I can feel on just steps away from where I'm sitting right now, which is my balcony, to across the globe. It's a really amazing, what I would call like a silver lining in what is absolutely a difficult time for all of us, but brings us to a place of hope and gratitude for one another.
Thank you for joining us. As I watch these different, in some cases originally spontaneous, in some cases invited outdoor happenings. One of the things that's interesting is also just how different countries express it, right? So like the choice of song, and then which are the songs, and what are the words that people are actually listening to versus nonverbal songs or just instruments. Clapping, right, which is actually nonverbal. And you mentioned your parents in the Upper West Side. So I first learned about this ritual or this expression on a family Zoom call. So like maybe some of you, we had this kind of spontaneous multi-generational Zoom call probably 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I have family, I'm half Indian, I have family in a number of different countries, and we had a call. So from 5-year-old to our 93-year-old grandmother. And one of the people on the call is my cousin, and my cousin is now joining us, Dr. Priyank Narayan. And Priyank, I'd love to hear, one of the things that I was most touched by on that call was we went around and just said what is one thing that we each did wherever we were, whether Hong Kong or Australia or New Delhi or New York, what is one thing we all did in the last 24 hours that we never imagined having done? And Priyank and a number of our cousins and aunts and uncles in New Delhi all said this one thing, which is 2 hours ago, we went out and we made a noise. And Priyank, I want to just, if you could almost rewind back to that first night. What happened? What did the Prime Minister ask for? And what was it like to be in New Delhi that evening and in the evening since?
Hi, good evening, good morning, good evening, part of the world. Namaste, I think that works the best from India. Priya, this was the most magical moment that many of us had ever experienced. Imagine the entire community out in the balcony, on the streets, at their door, and collectively experiencing the power of um, something that the Prime Minister had asked us to do. So if you're talking about gatherings, this was a gathering of 1.3 billion people doing the same thing at the same time across the country. And really, I think the sense of solidarity was so visible, and it was so present in the air that everybody, it was an emotional moment. It was also on the first day of the lockdown. So for all of us who sort of spent time caged in home, not used to this whole feeling of being locked down, it was a moment of release. It was a moment of thanking the community that's working out there. And I think it worked very well. It kind of connected people beyond just the fact that they were frustrated. So, it sort of connects the two very well.
If we were to step outside at 5 p.m., and what actual noises would we hear? Like what would you hear?
Yeah, so it was a combination of bells. It was the shank shells, which is very traditionally Indian, and it's also very auspicious. So a lot of people actually do that before they pray or before they celebrate. And of course, all kinds of rattles and vessels, and kids pulling out their trumpets. So it was a combination of all these sounds. But most importantly, Priya, like you would know, it was multi-generational. So homes have many generations of families living together, and all of them collectively came out, spent time together for those 10, 15 minutes at 5 o'clock that day, and were doing the same task. And that is not just uniting us as a country, but also as a family, because as a family, we were all looking at the watch for that moment to go out there and be with everybody.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Before you go back inside and everyone gets back on their phones. That's beautiful. Well, thank you, Priyanka and Dana, for joining us, and stay safe. You're welcome to stay on and listen. We're going to open it up to the community. Amanda, as we close this part of the conversation, as you listen to this, is any thoughts of arising as to what you're seeing, whether it's through clapping or just the gatherings or rituals that you're seeing being invented right now that are catching your eye?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's so interesting in every case. Like you said, this is something that exists because there's a pretense for it, but that pretense has also opened up these other possibilities that have nothing to do with the original intent. So yeah, for my husband and me, for sure, it's like a really fun thing that we are looking forward to doing together too. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, it's like the one thing that we do that's not just, private between us. So it's been nice.
Yeah.
It's nice to see that that's happening everywhere too.
It's beautiful. It's this actually interesting invention of a third space, but the third space is your doorstep, right? You can't go to
Right.
Starbucks. And I've had a number of New Yorker friends say, my stepsister lives in Maryland, and she says, we recently moved here. We haven't known our neighbors, and now we're part of 6 different Facebook groups and can't keep up with the social distance happy houring, like on the block. And so it's kind of someone else described it to me in New York, at least, as sort of this post 9/11, when you start looking at strangers again and you realize, wow, I actually want to know my neighbors.
Right. Even though I literally can't go shake their hand or actually say hi, it's really nice to sort of get acquainted with them.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Again, you're welcome to stay, but we really appreciate your time. Amanda, keep helping us know how to interpret these times online and off, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to the rest of you, we have over 300 people on this call, 297. And what I've been really interested in lately, so if you haven't tuned into the podcast, it's called Together Apart. We started 3 weeks ago. And every week I basically hear from a caller whose gathering has been upended by Corona in some way. The first episode we looked at Passover Seder, and it was a woman named Ellen who, for the first time in 40 years, wasn't going to be able to gather with her friends and family, 40 people, and we're going to move it on Zoom. The second episode was about a birthday party and a moment of transition for a 17-year-old whose graduation has been canceled and her prom has been canceled, and her 18th birthday party had kind of ostensibly been canceled. And how do we begin to invent new forms in this moment? And the episode that dropped yesterday was about baby showers, which might seem like a specific gathering only if you're interested in you're at that moment of life, but it was a way to actually look at whether something as simple as a baby shower, when both parents are home, might actually be an opportunity to interrupt and to talk about gender norms in this kind of new environment when the other partner isn't going back to work so quickly. So we're going to open the lines now, and I would love to hear. This is going to be an experiment every week. We are moving more and more into participation as we are figuring out the tech. I'd love to hear from you, either questions around gatherings for me, future gatherings you're thinking about, but also really we'd love to hear short, 30-second examples of gatherings that you have seen, that you've been a part of, that you've been watching, that have been inherently novel to this time, whether online or off. It doesn't just have to be clapping, but we'd love to just we inspire one another around new ways of thinking about coming together. So the line is open.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hi, my name is Naomi. I live on the Upper West Side, Dana's old neighborhood, and I just wanted to let her know that we are doing her proud. One way I have, since you had asked, chosen to gather, my girlfriends from college and I get together every year for a reunion in a randomly selected city. This would have been our 16th year. But instead of doing that, we are now every Thursday night using Twitch to stream a movie and chat about it at the same time. So we have a vote every week on how what movie we choose, and we are streaming that and having a conversation as it goes along. And it is something that I look forward to every Thursday.
And you used to gather once a year, and you've now sped it up to once a week.
Yep. We chat we have a group chat on Slack that we have been participating in for years, but this is our gathering. My father asked me to Zoom dinner tonight. I'm like, sorry, I already have plans.
And let me ask you a quick question. I know you're supposed to be asking me a question, but how has, so here Naomi's talking about almost an interruption, right? An interruption into the reunion. But what I hear is also an interruption into the pattern of coming together intentionally once a year, and you're now doing it 52 times a year.
Hopefully it's not 52
hopefully, right?
But year, but yeah,
right. No, meaning you're watching a movie once a week together, right?
Correct. Yes.
So how has so it's also interrupted the pattern of how often you're actually having a synchronistic experience. How has that changed the relationship?
I think it has brought us closer together. First of all, being all in quarantine in different cities around the country, it's this shared experience. We all have our own lives. I would be going out to dinner with, friends in New York if I were not quarantined at home. Somebody else would be going out in Chicago. But this is, we're all in the same place, home, at the same time. And it is our way of coming together. It's having a routine. It is something I literally look forward to every week. In fact, one of my girlfriends, the one in Chicago, is the one that introduced me to your book a while ago. So thank you for that, Jamie. And it is something that I really, I absolutely love. And I hope it keeps up. I don't know if it will once all this is over, but it has definitely increased our time of spending quality time together.
That's great. Well, Thank you for sharing. And we'll go to the next caller. One thing for everybody listening, one of the things that Naomi is reminding me of is we all have kind of implicit and explicit social maps or kind of social networks, not to be confused with networking. And I think one of the things that ends up happening, particularly once you're not in a moment of transition or not in an experience like college or a new job fair or moving to a new city, once you're kind of stagnant in your routines, is we tend to hit the same few beats of the same people over and over again, right? The same people that we work with, or the people that we live with, our roommates or our partners. And one of the elements that's getting interrupted in this time is actually who we are thinking of. Interruption often allows us to think of new people or people that we haven't thought of in a very long time. And so one tip, just as you're thinking about over the coming weeks, is just like Naomi talked about with her girlfriends, now that you're at some level, not limited to seeing the people in your neighborhood or city, who might you want to see and online and around what? So ready for the next caller.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Natalia, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for just this call. It's really great to hear from you. So I'm really curious to know your thoughts on the future of gatherings for teams and the workplace. So just for some background, I work for an edtech startup called Learning Innovation Catalyst, and I actually work remote. So I like to joke with my teammates and say, I've actually been preparing for this COVID crisis for like 2 years now because I've been working from home ever since. So my team and I both feel super equipped to, address the social isolation, if you could call it that, because of how we've already been working at distance. But of course, as our annual meeting is coming up, and that's one of the best ways that we actually do connect every year to actually build ideas and kind of move forward into the year, I'm really concerned about how we're going to be, really building that team dynamic where we create that culture together without having the in-person presence. And so I just wanted to know your thoughts on like the future of gatherings of teams in the workplace. I'm really interested by this. I'm also the operations manager, so I'm just looking for ideas to actually revamp.
You're not asking for a friend. Yeah. You're asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Well, it's such a great question. I would take it in a couple of parts. So the first is, like you, there are populations that have been gathering remotely well before Corona. And remote workers are one of them. And I think one of the opportunities that we actually have and should be doing is centering those experiences and learning from those experiences. I spoke to a woman a few weeks ago who works at automotive, and she's actually an events planner there, and she has been creating it's a completely distributed company in which many of the employees have been working remotely for 20 years. And they do everything from remote, and have been pre-corona, remote happy hours. One example that really moved me is a remote memorial in which she hosted a 24-hour memorial, and they have offices all over the world, multiple time zones, where anyone for 24 hours, different people would host it for different periods of times, but you can just pop in and share a story or a memory of the loved one, of the employee that they lost. Again, well before Corona. I'm also thinking of another community, which is disabled community. The disabled community has for years been saying things like, can you live stream this event? Can you create access, and have had very interesting and creative ways that they've been connecting together apart. I think a particularly eloquent person on this is Sasha Constanza Schock. And you can look at their tweets. I would say, so a couple of ideas on how specifically for teams. And I love this question because I think it's at the edge of many of our thinking, and we're still inventing it. But I was speaking recently. There's a person you should follow on Twitter. His name is @AaronZ.Lewis. And he had this tweet. I think I actually mentioned it last week as well. And he talked about this idea of social skeuomorphia, which is when you try to when you try to bring your offline gatherings online and don't make any changes. And I talked to him this week, and I asked him, a question like this: what are some of the most interesting gatherings you're seeing? And he gave this fascinating example from Teams. And so here's what it is. I'll give the example, and then we'll move to the next question. But the example sheds light on the directions I think we can take. So he gave me this example. He said, there are exercises in team dynamics in organizational workshops, like the 6 roles of a team, or David Cantor's 4 models, where facilitators come in and they teach a team and they try to change a dynamic by showing all of the roles that that anyone can play in a team that's helpful to an extent. So like the leader, the follower, the devil's advocate, the bystander, the interrupter. And what they do in person in these workshops is they have different color hats, right? So I'm putting the blue hat on and say, okay, right now I'm going to be the leader. And if I put the red hat on, I'm going to be the opposer. And he said, what if we're just at the very beginning of this, but he said, what if we created online codes? So if you're in Zoom, there's an infrastructure that's inherited, but you can change your background screens. And what if you, for a workshop on team building, you had a conversation and you all agreed to 6 colors of a code of what, based on emotions. If you think this is ridiculous, it's a red. if you're triggered, it's a yellow. If you're loving the idea, it's a blue. If you're, and so on. You can make it whatever you want. And what if you had an entire conversation in which you are actually using people's Zoom backgrounds to code different types of conversation? And I thought this was fascinating, whether or not, for whatever you use it for. And I'll leave you with the idea that I think much of this is still being invented, and it's the interaction between what actually could we uniquely do online that we can't offline, but also what is it that we're missing offline, and how do we invent new forms online?
Right. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we can go to the next question. I see Carmen.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi. I'm Grace, not Carmen, so I wasn't sure if I was. Sorry about that. So I don't have so much a question, but I just wanted to give a very new example of the way I'm virtually meeting people, which is I have this game called Animal Crossing, which I heard from other friends that they've also gotten. And you can visit your friends on that game. You can visit their island. And so we've been setting up meetings to visit each other on our different islands. So even though we're not meeting in person, our virtual avatars are meeting in the game. And it's been great because I have friends from afar that I haven't seen in a really long time, even before Corona, where we're now meeting in the game and connecting through the game, because you can chat at the same time while you're in the game as well. So it's been really great.
And can you, in that game, can you physically get close to each other in your avatars?
Yes.
And what's that experience like, to actually be able to virtually do something that physically we can't right now?
It's a lot of fun because you can also pick different emotions. You can emote in the game, show joy, show delight, or even show sadness. So it's just a fun way where sometimes we chat, like video chat at the same time, but otherwise it's just like I'm seeing them in their avatar and saying hi to them. You can't hug, but you can be near each other, which is nice.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think there are communities online that have been doing this, for years, whether it's like live action role playing online or offline, or VR, various VR experiences. And I think one of the things that's happening right now, in part because we're so constrained by what we can do in person, is the acceleration of the use of these tools is happening at a rate that isn't just for, what people would think of as like gamers. And I think it's a fascinating moment to look at the acceleration of the adoption of tools that we often, that often stay in remote corners of the internet. So thank you for that example. I think we have time for a few more callers. I'm ready for the next one.
Hello there, I'm Julie.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, thank you. It's a really interesting discussion. I thought, from my perspective, I think it's fascinating if you look at the different cultures, and this idea that people want to naturally come together, they want to gather, And it was good to hear your speakers earlier in terms of the lady from Italy, that it felt very much that it came from the people, from the community, and the idea in the UK of the sort of clap for workers and everything. And then the gentleman from Delhi, the idea being that the sort of the government had stepped in, and it was a government initiative, you know, like this is now what we need to do. And it's just, I guess, less than a question, but just an interesting observation of cultures and the way that we're tackling this crisis around the world.
Julie, I was thinking the same thing, and if we had a little bit more time, I would have pushed that button. Let me ask you, if you were to be asked by your government to go and go outside and clap at 5 p.m., what would you think?
I think I would get into it, but I think I'd be more inclined to do it if through social media or through my friends in my community or my neighbors had said, hey, you know what, at 5 o'clock we should get out there and applaud the health workers. And we get it, you know, it's a different, you know, you look at different communities around the world and different governments and the way, you know, even the thing about wearing masks and, you know, whether that, you know, in Asia, for example, it's a very natural thing. You know, the government says you wear your mask, you go out, this is what you do. Whereas here in the UK or in the States, you know, we fight for our freedoms of, you know, of these, of being told what to do. So I just thought it was an interesting discussion, and I very briefly, I joined with one of the Hatch organizations, one of their calls last week, and there was a gentleman on there, a coach, and he was talking about the fact that from an individual standpoint, these video calls have allowed those that would not normally speak up in meetings to actually start raising their hand. And I think that's interesting as well from a psychological sense, that those of us that are happy to raise our hand and would be more sort of chatty in a live situation, it's actually perhaps giving a voice to a wider range of people, which could be a good thing.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's a lovely example of the many ways this interrupted new form of engaging. And I know we are really on this conversation talking about interacting as a group through technologies like Zoom or Google Hangout. But what it does to group dynamics when a context is different, who feels more comfortable to speak up or doesn't. I was on a call the other day where we were talking about power, like power in Zoom. And the idea that somebody wrote this on my Instagram. They said something like, it was actually really powerful to enter a room and have everybody be the same size window, right? The same size square. And it created this equality, this sense of equality that we've never had when people are like pulling different size chairs up to a table where there's multiple rows. And then on the flip side, I was talking to a designer who was starting to think about the idea that we're stuck in these windows and there's no space for self-expression and they're all the same size. And what would it look like to have, you know, not just rectangular lines, but what would it look like to be able to play with shape and space and all of that. And I think even the dynamics, you know, speaking of some power dynamics, the request to ask everybody to zoom in and to turn your video camera on, if you're not having a virtual background, on one hand, it creates an intimacy with coworkers that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise have because you're seeing the context of their life behind them, or the North Korean expert moment where his, daughter bursts into the room where we are all that expert now. But on the other hand, it can, as I've also heard on other calls, perpetuate an inequality, right? You see somebody's, beautiful redone kitchen in the background, and you see other people's, shoe boxes. And so I think because we didn't choose this, I think we're only, like any type of gathering, we're going to start seeing the ramifications in a lot of different ways. So thank you both. On the government point, I know we'll move to the next caller. A thought I would just leave you all with on that is part of gathering, gatherings work. I don't believe everybody should gather in a specific way at all. I think that the gatherings are powerful when they're organic, and they're organic when they come from a real felt need. It can't be imposed on, even if it's a beautiful gathering. If it's something that I don't want to do, or I feel that somebody with power or an institution with power is imposing on me, I will resist it. And so and we just sort of flicking at that a little bit between the conversation with Amanda and Priyanka earlier, of if a gathering or a ritual feels like there's a real organic need from within a community, what does that look like versus a request from the outside, however you define what the outside is, but from a position of power look like? And this idea of ritual and national ritual feels very different in different contexts and in different relationships with authoritarianism. So thank you. Let's go to the next caller. And I believe this will be the final question.
Hi, I'm Holly from Atlanta.
Hi, Holly.
I just wanted to share a few things that we've been doing. I have a teenage daughter who is 15, and it seems like all of her friends have had a birthday in the last 4 or 5 weeks, and we've done drive-by birthdays. Mm-hmm. So we line up around the corner at about 4:25, and then at 4:30 we start driving by the birthday girl's house, and they wave out the window, and then we just go home. There's no presents, there's no anything, but it's just a really happy kind of giddy experience. And the first one we went to, my daughter had made a sign and held it up. The second one we went to, people were blowing bubbles out the windows, or having sparklers, or big happy birthday banners from one end of the car to the next. And yesterday we had one of these, and the girls, we got there a little bit early, and they stood on the sidewalk, from car to car, just kind of talking to each other up and down the sidewalk, which was, it's just changed, what social gatherings were and what they look like now. Mm-hmm. And you've been hitting on something that I'm wondering about teenagers. So a lot of them are on online school and have these Zoom calls that are, pulled up by their teachers or their schools or whatever. I'm not seeing from my teenage daughter, we worry about screenagers and everything. I don't see a lot of organic Zoom meetings just together with them. Everything they're doing, it seems like it's from the school. They're on their technology, but they're not reaching out like we are as far as having Zoom parties. My husband and I have been having Zoom tales with people all over the country that we knew in our 20s, or somebody I worked with 25 years ago. He and his wife, we had Zoom tales the other night, and they kind of expand into this wonderful evening of connecting with people. I don't have to get on a plane. It's just so easy to connect now with people that I've not seen in years. And I don't know.
And when you say, sorry, just to clarify for the listeners, when you say Zoom tales, I'm assuming that's like Zoom plus cocktails. Is that what that means?
Zoom, okay. Exactly. A new term. Mm-hmm. And then I've got another group of friends. We were all parents together in our elementary schools, and our children have gone off to different schools now in high school. And so there's a standing Zoom call from 4:30 to 5:30 every day, and it's about 15 parents. And every day, probably anywhere from 3 to 6 people show up, and it's different each day. And not everybody can do it, because a lot of us are working or not, or whatnot. But it's 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, 4:30 to 5:30 is the standing group call of about 15 people. And so that's been really nice that you can kind of turn to if you needed a break. And it is interesting how, when this all happened in the middle of March, the whole shutdown, how there was nothing on the calendar. And
Yeah.
now there's all these calls.
Now you have a thick
and they
social life.
overlap. And, oh, I can't do it then. I've got a Zoom call or whatnot.
Thank you, Holly. You know, I think that I said this, last week we did a podcast episode on a birthday, and it was actually for a teenager. And I said this then, which is we are all experiencing this pandemic in different ways at different times in different moments. And there are some of us who have, you know, thickly filled social calendars, and there are others of us that are, you know, having trouble kind of getting out of bed, and that's often the same person, right? So we're all kind of oscillating and figuring out this temporary normal. And I think the generational question is an interesting one. I think the only thing I would say is, as a parent, if you see something that, well, I would say two things, and they might seem like they're at odds with each other. But the first is different generations connect in different ways, and look a little bit more closely as to the sources of meaning that your child might be getting in a way that they may be connecting with their friends that you wouldn't with yours. And then I think the second is, there are all of these studies that, you know, live interaction is, even if it's not in person or video, is much better for socio-emotional, you know, bonding and learning than asynchronistic chat. And so if you feel like you want to introduce or host something, or invite your daughter or son to do something, to perhaps create a gathering, use an excuse of a birthday, or use an excuse of something that is very specific to your child, in a way that, you know, wouldn't necessarily embarrass them, to model some of that, you know, stories from generations before, or just something that they would want to host for parents. You know, I don't know what it is, but to kind of interrupt those patterns and see what it might be like. I know we are at time. I want to thank you all for joining us. Holly, thank you for your questions. Thank you all for your questions. I think we are in a super complicated, challenging, interesting, painful time. And as we continue our physical distancing from each other, we are all finding ways to see if we can continue to be together apart. And one of the ways we do that is through learning from novel examples of other people. And so we invite you to share with us the ways you are gathering together apart, your questions. Every week, the Together Apart podcast drops on Wednesday mornings. Right now, we're looking for more examples from workplace meetings, within hospitals. We are starting to look also and take questions on funerals. You can submit your questions and your future gatherings at priyaparker.com/podcast, and also sign up for our newsletter there. And this conversation is part of a slate of digital events that the Times is producing to help readers navigate the world we find ourselves in today. The Times events team are doing virtual events every single day across the board and across a lot of different topics. To find out more about the next Together Apart Live and also all of our other upcoming events, please visit timeevents.nytimes.com. And finally, we want to give a special thank you to all of our subscribers. You make our work possible, and we look forward to speaking with you again. Be well.